Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson and I am Professor of English and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. This is going to be the introduction to a new set of episodes on the West African encounters with Europe from the 15th century to the early 20th century. In this episode, we will be discussing the epistemic and social upheavals represented in the building of the Castello di São Jorge da Mina, Elmina Fort, later Castle, in 1482 in the township of Elmina in what is today's Ghana. The original name for Elmina was Anomansa, which means inexhaustible water. This reflected the presence of a freshwater source that was very important to the establishment of the township in the 1300s. Much has been written about the connection between Elmina Castle on the coast of the Gold Coast, which is now of course Ghana, and slavery, but there has been no reflection on the epistemic upheaval that it must have represented for the people of the township when it was first built in 1482. Thus, this episode will explore the circumstances surrounding the building of the castle and will speculate on the forms of epistemic and social upheavals that it must have represented in the year 1482 and thereafter. Rumors of lands rich in ivory and gold got the Portuguese Prince Henry the Navigator to send ships to explore the Guinea coast, otherwise known as West Africa, in 1418. They also sought a southern route to India so as to avoid Arab traders and to establish a direct link to Asia. Thoughts of Christian proselytizing also preoccupied them, as did the hope of establishing an alliance with the mythical Prester John, whom they believed had established a Christian nation far away from Europe, perhaps in Africa. The Portuguese established trading posts along the Guinea coast starting from Cape Verde in 1444. By 1471, they had arrived at Elmina. Fernão Gomes was granted monopoly over the Guinea coast in 1469 by King Alfonso V of Portugal. He was charged with exploring 100 leagues of the coast of Africa each year for 5 years in exchange for the payment of 200,000 reais per annum to the Portuguese crown. He was also granted a monopoly of the trade in Guinea pepper, for which he paid an extra 100,000 reais to the crown. On arriving at Elmina in 1471, Gomes discovered the lively gold trade that was already flourishing among the natives and being traded with Arab traders. He decided to establish a trading post and to settle there with two other Portuguese merchants that had come along with him. The Portuguese named the township La Mina, the mine, a name that was corrupted by the locals to Elmina, and that has remained the name of the place to this day. Fernão Gomes became fabulously wealthy and was rewarded with appointment to the Royal Council in Lisbon, among other perks. By the early 1500s, the Portuguese were reputed to be exporting 24,000 ounces of gold a year from Elmina, which represented about 10% of the global gold supply at the time. In 1481, the regular reports that Fernão Gomes was sending back to Lisbon persuaded the recently crowned King Yao II to build a fort in the town to guarantee protection of the gold and ivory trade from other Europeans. King Yao dispatched all the materials to build the fort on 10 caravels and 2 transport ships in 1482. The materials included everything from prefabricated building blocks to roofing materials, doors, metal hinges, and various other building materials. These were accompanied by 600 men made up of 500 armed soldiers and 100 artisans. The arriving Portuguese were led by Don Diego de Azambuja and was said to have included one Christopher Columbus, subsequently to become famous for the discovery of America in 1492. Brodie Cruikshank tells us in the book 18 Years on the Gold Coast of Africa that the debarkation of the Portuguese was accomplished with much pomp and ceremony. They marched to the local village, unfurled the royal banner of Portugal upon a high tree, placed an altar under its shade, and celebrated Mass and offered up prayers for the speedy conversion of the Africans and the prosperity of the church about to be erected. It should be noted that the population of Elmina at this time was estimated at between 200 to 300 people, so that the arrival of the Portuguese with all their armed soldiers and pomp and pageantry must have represented nothing short of a phenomenal occurrence to the local population. But what followed after their arrival was nothing short of an occupation. On debarkation, the Azambuja met with Kwamina Ansa, the king of Elmina, to negotiate a piece of land for the building of their trade fort. Even though Kwamina Ansa received them warmly, as he had always received Portuguese traders before them, he was reluctant at first to grant them land for a permanent settlement. He said to them, "Though the sea and the land are neighbors, they are always at variance and contending who shall give way. The sea with a great force attempting to subdue the land, and the land with the same strength resolving to oppose the sea." But he was persuaded on being given gifts of guns and gunpowder, alcohol, enamel basins, and various other goods. Some commentators suggest that the Portuguese also brought with them mirrors, and that this must have produced a great sense of wonder and attraction to King Ansa and the people of his court. I personally take this to be a straight insult to the intelligence of the Africans of the time, given that items such as mirrors must have already been familiar to them from the Arab traders that they had had dealings with over several decades before the Portuguese arrived. Arab traders had been important conduits for the circulation of goods from Europe via the trans-Saharan trade. This means that the locals were already familiar with European goods, and that the effect of the Portuguese was to cut out the Arab middlemen and to increase the quantity of these goods that they now made available. In the negotiations, King Ansa was also threatened of possible reprisals by the King of Portugal if he did not agree. Given that Fernão Gomes had already lived among them for all of 10 years since 1471, in what we may now describe today as a form of industrial espionage, it is clear that the Portuguese would have known all of Elmina's secrets, both internally and in its relations to their aggressive neighbors. The Portuguese promised to help King Ansa to fend off his warlike neighbors and detractors. King Ansa offered them a rocky promontory on the coast. This large rock happened also to be considered by the local Elminians as a deity. So there was some resistance to the Portuguese building their fort there. The Portuguese were forthright and utterly ruthless. They proceeded to demolish the homes of those near the site who resisted them, and in response the locals attacked them, leading to several deaths among the Portuguese. As we shall see in a moment, the early resistance to the Portuguese sat alongside local accommodation to their presence throughout their residence at Elmina Castle. In her essay, Venus in Two Acts, Saidiya Hartman coins the term critical fabulation to describe a method of weaving historical and archival research with speculative narrative and storytelling as a way of addressing the silences in official archives, and also for animating the voices of those who have no voice within the archives. This is particularly pertinent to the early West African encounters with Europeans, since almost all the documents we have from the 15th century onward were recorded from the European perspective. But the critical fabulation I'm interested in here has to do with how the local Elminians must have perceived the fort and subsequent castle as it rose upon the coast. To do this, we have to first consider the architecture of the fort. Where did the idea come from for this kind of architecture, and what was its inspiration? All the forts and castles on the Guinea coast ultimately took their inspiration from the forts and castles in medieval Europe. These shared some essential features with their counterparts on the Guinea coast from the 15th century onwards. In the first place, the fort at Elmina was constructed as a fortified fortress whose objective was to give the people inside of them advantages in tactics, weapons, and siege techniques in relation to their environment. Apart from the watchtowers on different points of the fortification, Elmina Castle, even to this day, has a moat and a drawbridge, making it completely reminiscent of the castles we associate with medieval knights in popular culture. Secondly, like its counterparts in medieval Europe, the architecture of Elmina Castle was not organic to the architecture of the surrounding area. It was not, for example, a gigantic mud hut with a thatched roof to mirror the overall architecture of habitation in the period, but was something completely different in size and conception. At 2.32 acres, it was very large with sharp geometric edges and was painted all in white. It had cannons pointing down at the sea and also toward the village. Thus, not only was it not designed to be organic to the landscape, but also to dominate it with a clear sense of authority and power. And it is this that interests me. After the initial resistance to its construction, what must the villagers have thought of this monstrosity that had been planted between them and the sea? Consider yourself an old woman living close to the sea, whose home was one of those torn up by the Portuguese to build their fort. How must this old woman have felt not only about the loss of her home and livelihood, but also at the sight of this mammoth architectural imposition on the landscape? And what must she have wondered about the sudden proliferation of Portuguese men with guns, completely outnumbering the villagers by something like 3-1, a far cry from Fernão Gomes and the few other European merchants that had resided amongst them for the previous 10 years. I speculate here, of course, but I think that the building of the Elmina fort from 1482 with subsequent additions until it became a large castle represents nothing short of an epistemic upheaval in the consciousness of the locals. I was asked by my colleague Daniel Shanahan recently what I thought would have been the primary ontological and epistemological tools of the population of Elmina in trying to understand that massive fortification on the beach. Would it have been their religion, their kinship networks, or what? This question struck me as an extraordinarily interesting one, to which unfortunately I do not have a straightforward answer. But I think we can safely surmise that the people of Elmina in 1482 were guided by the beliefs, codes, and routines stipulated by their local gods, many of whom derived their authority from nature, such as the deities of the sea, the hills, the forests, and so on. These were both sources of mystery and of morality. They also would have derived their spiritual framework from the specific social codes enjoined through their economic relations. The people of Elmina at this time were primarily fishermen and salt workers. That is to say, they produced salt extracted from seawater, which is a very lucrative good even to this day. Salt was very much sought after by Arab traders who took it back with them across the Sahara to North Africa and elsewhere. But there were also gold traders. And because of the gold trade to be found at Elmina, the people were already embedded into the trans-Saharan economy of Arab traders, as well, of course, with the European merchants represented by the Portuguese, who finally came to settle among them. The point is that their belief systems were likely both stable, that is to say, drawing on the firm predictabilities of nature, and also shifting and somewhat changeable, that is to say, relying on the vagaries of trade with non-denizens and strangers. It is my argument, however, that nothing in their epistemic worldview will have prepared them for the violent occupation of the Portuguese and the active proselytizing of their brand of Christianity. This is where I think the epistemological crisis came from, materialized at the start from the incredible fortress that they built on the coast to demarcate their residential space from that of the rest of the Elmina villagers. At its very inception, the castle was a form of terrifying residential racial segregation that was to have resonances for social relations within the township for a very long time afterwards. From 1597, the Dutch began the first of a series of attacks on the Portuguese at Elmina, finally succeeding in dislodging them and taking over the castle fully in 1637. In the lead up to the ultimate victory of the Dutch, the Portuguese had made themselves deeply unpopular by tampering with the scales used to measure gold dust. This was the accusation of the locals, who felt themselves as being exploited in their own land. The Portuguese also enforced a barbaric agreement that barred the Elminians from trading with any other partners but them, on pain of having an ear cut off. This continued the theme of violent occupation and control that had been established a century earlier on the building of the castle. The third factor that roused the locals was the advent of the slave trade, which by the time the Dutch defeated the Portuguese was in full force to distort all social relations among them. However, the Dutch did know better, but proceeded to continue with the slave trade once they had dislodged the Portuguese. The slave trade was to overtake gold and ivory as the primary exports from Elmina and other parts of the Guinea coast from the early 1500s through to the mid 1800s. This was to completely commoditize not just human beings, but also the very principles undergirding social relations on the coast. As we shall see in later episodes, in addition to Christianity and Westernization, the commoditization of persons and social relations was to have a deleterious effect on the development and self-understanding of Africans, both on the continent itself and in its diverse diasporas. Thank you very much. Please remember to check out the suggested readings in the episode's description. And if you like this episode, give it a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.